Hey everyone, Dylan with ON1 here, and in this video, I want to give you guys a few basic tips on shooting lifestyle and commercial photography. And then I want to show you guys from start to finish how I would post-process a commercial photo using ON1 Photo RAW 2018. So let's get started here. So I only have a couple basic tips that I like to think about whenever I'm shooting commercial photography, and the first of those is I like to think about lighting. And when it comes to commercial photography or lifestyle photography, lighting is pretty much key. If you have a well-lit subject, a nicely lit background, and you have something interesting in the frame, usually you're going to have a good lifestyle or commercial photo. For this shot, I actually set up two softbox lights, and I aimed one at him, and then I aimed one at her, so that they were equally lit in this photograph, and the window wasn't blown out, and they weren't just super dark. If I hadn't put any lighting on them, the window would be probably the best lit area on this photo, and they would be pretty dark because my camera would be compensating for the window and not for my subjects here. If you don't have any softbox lights to use for your shoot, or you just want to do it guerrilla style and sort of go out and get some photos, that's probably the funnest way to do it. And a few ways that you can achieve nice lighting by doing that is you can use windows to your advantage. You can use the light from the windows to light up your subjects. So if it's a nice bright day or overcast day, you can set your subjects in front of the window and shoot from there, and that should provide some nice lighting for them. If you're not at a place that has a window, you can try to use a reflector or maybe a white piece of board, and you can hold that in front of whatever light you have to try to reflect it. You can also use a reflector or a piece of whiteboard to hold in front of a window to get some nice light bouncing off that. So there is a bunch of different ways that you can add light to your scene without actually having softbox lights or artificial lights added onto your set. The next basic tip I usually like to think about whenever I'm shooting commercial photos is I like to think about adding interest into my shot. So if you're at a shoot or you're shooting commercial and lifestyle photos, or you're just out, having a good time getting photos, really try to think about what you can do to add interest into your photos. So for example, this shot, I basically just shot from a lower angle so that I could use this sort of rope right here as a leading line into my subjects. And that also provided a nice little barrier here between my two subjects, so they weren't sort of jumbled, and it added a nice little sort of line, I'd like to call it, a little line that sort of separated the trainer from the trainee, and it kind of just added some interest into my shot. And so I would think about that whenever you're shooting photos, is just sort of try to get an interesting perspective, or maybe try a new angle that you haven't before to sort of get a unique look on an already, basic shot. So those are just a few basic tips that I like to think about whenever I'm shooting commercial photos. So now on to the fun part, and that is the editing part of the shoot. So basically, right now I'm just gonna set the overall tonality for the photo. And so what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna hold down my J key, and that's going to give me all of my true white and true black in my photo. So I have a little bit of true black down here, and I have some true white, in the window here, and then this light. So I'm just going to pull back on my exposure a little bit to remove some of that true white. And now what I'm gonna do is I'm actually just going to boost the shadows a bit. And one thing I like to do whenever I'm editing lifestyle photos is I really like to boost the midtones. I feel like lifestyle and commercial photos sort of have this well-lit look to them, where all of the sort of tones mesh together really well, and it seems, well exposed. So I'm just going to increase the midtones a bit. And I'm also going to increase my contrast just to add a little bit more life to my photo. And remember that by adding contrast into your shot, or by decreasing the exposure, that you're also probably going to boost the saturation a little bit. So always pay attention to the colors in your shot, and if you do end up decreasing the exposure or increasing the contrast a little bit, just sort of pay attention to that. And if they do sort of oversaturate, you can always head down to your saturation slider and turn them down, and then pull them back up to a nice little saturation point for your photo. So now that I have my saturation set for my photo, the last thing I want to do inside of develop is I'm actually going to crop my photo a little bit. So I'm going to head up to my crop tool, And I'm just going to hold down my shift key and pull it in to make it a little tighter. And I'm actually going to try to use that window frame right here as sort of a nice little frame for the right side of my shot. And you'll also notice that you have these different lines in your crop tool, and this is basically laying out the rule of thirds. So you have 9 different rectangles on your shot, 2 different lines going horizontal and 2 different going up, and 4 intersecting points within them. So the theory is that if you put your subjects on the intersecting points of these lines, it's going to make it a more interesting photograph. So what I'm going to do is just try to line them up with, sort of those intersecting areas. And then if I hit enter, it turned out to be a nice little crop because it put my subjects on the intersecting points for the rule of thirds, and also used this sort of window as a nice little frame for the right side of my photo. So now we've set the basic tonality for our shot, and what I want to do now is I'm just going to take it inside of effects, and I want to show you guys a few of my favorite filters to use when it comes to editing lifestyle and commercial photos. So if we take our photo into effects here, the first filter I generally like to use whenever it comes to lifestyle or commercial is I like to add a little bit of detail into my shot. And how I do that is I add a filter, and of course I'm going to add dynamic contrast. And generally I don't like to add dynamic contrast onto portraits or people, but when it comes to lifestyle, it's almost kind of needed. I feel like lifestyle and commercial shoots have a lot of clarity and they feel like really sharp. So what I generally like to do is I just kind of like to go up to my masking options here, and I'm going to invert the mask so that it's not applied to all of my photo. And I'm going to make sure that I have my masking brush selected, and I'm going to hold down shift and hit X to switch it to paint in so that I can paint in my dynamic contrast. And I'm just going to sort of sloppily paint in a little bit of contrast onto their faces. And also, I'm actually just going to paint a little bit of contrast onto sort of the hands and also his arm right here. There we go. So now that if I turn that on and off, it's added some nice detail into their faces, their hands, and sort of made them come to life a little bit more. And you can always play with the opacity and the different controls for your dynamic contrast. I usually just like to pull down on my opacity and then just pull it up and get, to whatever point I like. That looks pretty nice. So now that I have some detail added onto my shot, the next filter I usually like to use when it comes to commercial shoots is I like to add sunshine. So if I go down and add sunshine to my shot here, you'll notice that it sort of brightens up my photo a little bit. Well, what sunshine is going to do is it's going to add sort of a sunshiny look to your photo. Basically, it's going to brighten your highlights and it's going to darken your shadows. So it's going to brighten the brighter areas in your photo, and it's sort of going to subdue the darker areas. So what I generally like to do is I like to take sunshine off of any window areas, but I love what it does to my subjects in my photos, especially if they're well lit to begin with. So if I turn this on and off, you'll see that it adds a lot to my shot. It really brings my subjects to life here, but it sort of overpowers this window. So what I can do is I'm just going to head to my masking bug right here. I'll grab that, I'll drop it on here, and I will just take it off of the window area. So now if I turn this on and off, it's only being applied to this area and not this area by the window. Also, you'll notice that my subjects here look a little bit oversaturated, so we can also cool them down a little bit. And we'll just turn down the saturation a tad. Right about there. So now that we've added the sunshine filter and some dynamic contrast to our shot, we've set the basic overall tonality. The last filter I generally like to add onto my commercial and lifestyle photos is I like to add a vignette. And the reason I like to add a vignette is because it really helps to remove these outer areas or areas in the corner that are distracting. So I usually like to click Big Softy, the preset style here, and you'll notice right away that it really helps to remove this outer area from my photo as a distraction, because it could be distracting to viewers, especially since there's a lot of space here. And also one thing that I like to do is I'll grab this centering tool and I'll just sort of drag it around until I get to where my subjects are, so that part of my vignette isn't covering my subject. So now if I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, you'll notice that we really made this photo come to life in just a few minutes using basic tonalities and only using 3 filters. Thanks so much for watching the video, guys. I'm Dylan with ON1, and stay tuned for more.